What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for the Dragon Quest 1 and 2 HD-2D Remake, which is going to be a bit of an odd review because it's two games, of course, but this time a reimagining of the beginnings of the pretty legendary at this point Dragon Quest series. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. But with that in mind, another important thing I have to tell you is that I did in fact receive a review key for this. However, I am clearly a couple weeks behind the ball on that, as this game originally, or these games I guess, originally released on October 30th. Square Enix sent me that review key like hours before the game itself launched, so obviously I was never going to make that embargo, and thus here we are as I've been working on it while I was doing some other stuff these past couple weeks as well. Also, probably worth a mention that while I'm not going to give like a complete play-by-play of the story or anything, there's likely to be what you could consider spoilers in here if you're looking to get into these games for the first time and listen to this story. You should obviously want to be aware of that then, as I'm going to talk about these two games and then how it relates back to the third game which they had released previously last year. But either way, this is going to be a bit of an odd review because, as you would imagine from the title, this is actually two games rolled into one. So let's talk about that a little bit. So the first thing to know is that the first game, both originally and here, was a pretty bare bones experience. Both of these games originally released in the late 80s before being remade once, I believe, in 2019 for the first game at least. And then here with their HD-2D, like from the ground up remake of what the originals were. One is pretty faithful to that original in the sense that, like, you know, the objectives are the same. A lot of it just is what it is. And so that experience is relatively short. Getting everything done in the first game was like a 15, 17 hour experience. And a couple hours of that was definitely me just running around trying to find everything. The story itself is like maybe 10. Dragon Quest 2, on the other hand, is a beefier experience. That in total was like 45 hours. There's post-game content, a couple different endings, an expansion of content. They've added like underwater exploration to that one. A lot going on there. So I'm going to try to bounce back and forth between the two as we go, but we'll kind of see how this winds up landing. However, the main thing to know really is just that one is a pretty bare bones experience. Likely why they doubled it up with this one. Now, from there, let's talk about the technical state. How is this game running? So for me, it was mostly pretty great, actually. Didn't run into any serious problems at all. In fact, I really only have one thing to report to you guys here, and that is that some items, if you equip them as accessories, are meant to like completely block like certain status effects from affecting you, and yet sometimes monsters seem to just ignore that. And I'm not sure if that's like intentional. They have something that's getting through those resistances because of the way the game's presented. I just don't have the ability to tell that. Or if that's like actually a bug or something, because it happened a couple of times here and there. Otherwise, though, it was a pretty smooth experience, which probably not too much of a surprise. I think Square Enix has pretty well got this type of game down pat. So next up, let's talk difficulty and some of the unique features here. So when talking about difficulty for these games, probably the first thing you should know straight away is that it's a fairly unbalanced experience, if we're all being honest with each other. One of the things people will tell you about the original games even, and a lot of older JRPGs like that in general, is that they were not like super balanced experiences. They could definitely be prone to gigantic difficulty spikes, silly stuff, and some of that is still present here. And while it's definitely doable, you can even grind past a lot of it if you really want to. You do have a ton of options with these remakes. For starters, you've got the three base difficulties, Draki, Dragon, and Draconian, each having an effect on like damage numbers, stuff like that. But probably, honestly, the most significant change is actually only available if you are on the lowest difficulty, because it's on by default, or you could turn it off and on as you please, and that is the Invincible mode. You can swap all of these difficulties at a moment's notice. None of the game is like locked behind certain difficulties, anything like that. So if you're having trouble with a particularly annoying boss and you just want to turn on Invincible mode to get past it, you can absolutely do that. Beyond that stuff, there are a couple of other things that relate to the difficulty for both games, like, for instance, turning on direction markers on the map for like your next objective. You can choose to have that stuff highlighted. You can also choose whether or not your characters will restore their health and mana upon level ups, and just some other stuff to help you customize that experience a little bit. which honestly, in terms of remakes for these really old titles, I'm always happy to see that stuff. I think options are great there to allow people to experience the story, which is, I would say, the primary focus of these remakes anyway. But speaking of the story, let's start talking about the story of these games. And we're going to divide that, of course, up into the first game as well as the second. Now, for the first game, you play as a lone hero. You hear a voice in your head telling you to go to a nearby town, Tantagel, so you can follow in the footsteps of your late ancestor, Erdrick. Now, the story of Erdrick is the subject of Dragon Quest III, the prequel that released last year. If you've played that, you'll know all about the exploits that led up to this moment. Erdrick's descendants went on to, of course, do what heroes do, roaming the land, solving problems, and we play one such descendant here. You will not get any other party members in this one. It is just your solo hero. It's a relatively short story. You go to Tantagel, find out they're dealing with a problem of the darkness returning, as your ancestor defeated the Lord of the Underworld, which was again the focus of 3. Here, however, the Dragon Lord has taken up residence in the old castle there, and is bathing the world in darkness, and you obviously want to stop that. You're going to do that by rescuing the princess, who has information you're going to need, and along the way you'll meet all sorts of types like the different fairies around that can help you craft the sigils you'll need to wake Rubus, the goddess or spirit of the land that's going to help you fight the darkness, that kind of thing, which is going to get you the equipment you need, that kind of stuff. So it's a very traditional hero's journey, as you would expect from the original game being very old. And as you would expect with a relatively simple setup, the gist of it is basically defeat the Dragon Lord and save the day. However, you may be surprised to learn that there are actually other endings. There's an optional bad ending where you just choose to side with the Dragon Lord. He'll offer you a proposition that you can choose to accept. It's very simple. You just do this right at the end and accept it. It's not really an ending per se. The screen just kind of fades to black and you're forced back to a checkpoint. There's the traditional ending, of course, of just simply defeating the Dragon Lord, but there is actually one more variation. You see, when you rescue the princess, you can take her back to Tantagel, or you could just bring her with you, which results in like extra cutscenes, dialogue, things like that. You can take her all the way to the Dragon Lord even. But something that was in the original that is not here is that you have to rescue the princess this time around. That is not optional. It was in the original game. So the ending where you defeat the Dragon Lord but don't actually rescue the princess just isn't a thing here. Now that's also pretty important because, as it may have been implied with the heroes of these games being descendants, the next game's protagonists are all the descendants of this hero and Princess Gwaelin, who canonically got together and went and founded a new kingdom. Which brings us to the story of Dragon Quest II. Dragon Quest II takes place quite a ways after the original game. It's a little unclear about how long. I've heard somebody mention like 100 years, but it seems way longer than that. Either way, though, in Dragon Quest II, the descendants of the Dragon Quest I protagonist eventually filtered out and built not just one nation, but 3. Middenhall, Cannock, and Moonbrook. The game kicks off showing you that there are children born to each kingdom, the prince and princesses accordingly, and that sometime later, the darkness has re-emerged as it was foretold in the first game by the spirit of the land, Rubus, and it just so happens that they attack the town of Moonbrook, destroying it completely, and your sort of main hero, the Prince of Middenhall, is sent off to warn the other nation, Cannock, but then also investigate what exactly happened to Moonbrook after a wounded soldier arrives on your doorstep. This leads you to a gathering of your cousins, the Prince of Cannock and the Princess of Moonbrook, and then later the Princess of Cannock as well, who is one of the new additions here. Now, by and large, the story itself remains the same. However, they added a fair few parts with like the underwater exploration and everything. Over the course of the game, you're going to learn that all of this has been orchestrated by an evil priest of sorts known as Hargan. Hargan is searching for the sigils. You don't initially know why, but having played the first game, ideally you'll have learned about this yourself. The sigils are necessary to summon Rubus. So once you sort of take stock of the situation, your first job becomes to go find a ship, which you can then sail around and start helping people and searching for the sigils, which forms the bulk of the story. Along the way, especially once you have the sigils, you're going to have to get some other information, like figuring out how to get into a place called Erdrick, which has become the sort of seat of all evil as Hargan's forces muster there, and it's not an easy place to access, surrounded by unpassable mountains for the most part. And that's going to take you all over the place, including even under the sea, which from what I understand is like a completely new thing here that I thought was pretty interesting. Wasn't expecting that. There's some stuff to actually find down there. A couple extra bosses, some storerooms, a ghost ship, that kind of thing. And sooner or later, you're going to make your way all the way to Hargan himself, but that's actually the catch here with this one. Dragon Quest II has a regular ending and a true ending. You do have to beat the game the first time to get the regular ending, which will then throw you into the post-game, which is going to open up a few extra areas called Cloud's Gate Citadel, as well as the Cave of Confusion. Handling the extra objectives associated with the Cave of Confusion specifically will lead you to getting the items and everything you need, basically, to approach the game's true ending, which is just more context, really. It takes the first ending and then builds on it, and then actually sort of comes full circle for the Erdrick trilogy, which is the first, second, and third game. And if you started with 3, I think actually wraps up this trilogy incredibly well, giving you a nice kind of full circle moment that I think was worth the journey. So all told, the story of these games is relatively simple, as you would expect just from the sheer age of them, but they've tried to do a lot here. The second game was expanded a lot, and as simple as they are, I think they still hit on a lot of like the main tropes of a hero's journey. And if you're not looking for anything too complicated, I think it's fun in that way. Across both of them, I would say my favorite parts personally were the Princess of Moonbrook coming to terms with her own grief and guilt after being one of the only people who survived the attack on her capital, where she was forced to deal with the death of her parents and everything. I think they did a lot with that, and I enjoyed going through it. But that does bring us to the progression systems. These actually stay mostly the same across both games, so we don't need to separate them out here, but it's essentially levels, finding scrolls to give you moves and abilities, in addition to learning them just by leveling up, increasing your stats via those level ups alongside seeds, equipment of course, and then other side things like these sigils. So let's talk about the sigils first. Those are things you have to collect across both games, and they actually do have effects that will grant you little benefits. Powering up your spells, giving you the option to use certain spells with individual characters to make them stronger, like when you're below half health, that kind of thing. Some of them are more general, some of them are a little more specific, but you can use them to pretty great effect if you lean into them. Leveling up and seeds are pretty straightforward. As you level up, you will gain stats according to who your character is. For instance, all the different princes and princesses in Dragon Quest II have different priority stats that will grow at different rates. You can adjust a little bit of that in both games with seeds. Seeds are permanent stat increasing items that you'll find a lot of, so be sure not to ignore them. And then there are these scrolls across both games. You can find scrolls that will teach your character's moves. In Dragon Quest I, they're obviously all for the only character in your party, which is you. And then in Dragon Quest II, these different scrolls are learnable by different characters, and you have to sort of pick and choose as you go accordingly. However, the game does have enough of each scroll to make sure that every character that can learn it learns it. And then last but not least, there is of course equipment, which changes a little bit from game to game, mind you, but some of the basics remain the same. Itemization does play a certain role here, more so in 2 than 1, because 1 is relatively straightforward, again, just very simple single party stuff. In 2, however, with all of the different bosses you'll be facing, a bigger emphasis on things like just straight up tactics, stuff like that. There are times and fights where swapping out your items and stuff will be extremely helpful, alongside simply finding ways to make yourself immune to various things, the stuff you would expect. It's relatively light, but definitely not something you should ignore either. Now we'll talk a little bit more about that in combat for each game, because next up I want to talk about the gameplay and world of each. Now, Dragon Quest I and 2 primarily take place in a world known as Alifgard. Coincidentally, the first game takes place in what is available of Alifgard in the third game, that sort of same map area. The second game, however, takes that original map and puts it in there, yes, but it's also much expanded to include all of the 3 nations that your descendants founded, and then of course the new stuff like Erdrick and the exploration underwater, and so there's a lot going on there. Now in terms of what to do and see in the game, Doesn't really change too much from game to game. In fact, I would say it's more or less on par with 3. You're going to explore the world, its dungeons, visit towns, do some side quests, investigate secret spots, the usual stuff. Basically, towns and dungeons are most of it. You're going to, of course, traverse the world map in between those things. The first game, you're on foot or have to use a fast travel spell known as Zoom, which is available in both the whole time. Whereas 2, you get the option to start traversing the sea. Now, you do have to, of course, be somewhere at least once before you can fast travel back, but you can, for the most part, freely fast travel otherwise once you unlock the Zoom spell. Now, out on the world map, there are, of course, little random items you can find, things like that, but there are also then the secret spots, which will usually contain some treasure, some people to talk to that can give you hints about things, but they can also contain things like equipment and mini-medals. Mini-medals are a returning thing here that, once again, let you in both games find a bunch of these hidden mini-medals throughout the game and then turn them in for prizes and stuff from the main person. That's actually important because there are collection achievements for the mini-medals, yes, but then also the rewards you get for the mini-medals usually include at least 1 or 2 scrolls that you're going to need to get the achievements for learning all of the scrolls. But luckily, these games have been out for a long time. Most of the guides you can find online are already entirely complete and easily found if you're looking for that stuff. The 3-key system comes up again. That is to say, in each game you can find the Thieves' Key, Magic Key, and the Ultimate Key, which is going to unlock the corresponding doors and allow you to get into places, find more mini-medals, equipment, unlock some general progression around that. The second game introduces something called the Tombola, which is basically like a little raffle thing that you can spend Tombola tickets that you earn by spending money in shops to get a chance at some random items. That was fun enough for what it was. You can get some good items in there. And then while the first game basically only has like 2 side quests, because it is so short, the second game has a lot more going on in this regard because it brings in things like the ship and underwater exploration, providing a whole new avenue of place to explore that actually has multiple layers. As you play through the game, you'll unlock this harp that lets you explore underwater to begin with, but then later on, it will actually let you dive even deeper, which can help you find some of the secret locales. And that's to say nothing of the second game's post-game, which unlocks 2 sort of special dungeons, Cloud's Gate Citadel and Cave of Confusion. Cloud's Gate Citadel should be familiar if you've played the third game, because it was in there as well. Basically, this is just a high-level area that's going to let you grind up the experience monsters who are made out of metal to help you grind up levels, and then you can use that to either take on the Cave of Confusion afterwards, which is a little more difficult, or to, of course, fight the dragon at the top of the Citadel. And defeating him in a certain amount of turns, eventually under 15, though it starts a little higher than that, will earn you rewards, including some of the scrolls you're going to need. In fact, one of the scrolls he'll reward you with is called Critical Claim, which guarantees a critical hit against the monster slime enemies that give the extra XP, which will kill them instantly, as opposed to having to, deal like a single damage to them and hope they die. But probably the more interesting one, truth be told, is the Cave of Confusion late game area. That is because this is a sort of amalgamation of different places you've been throughout the series, both this game and the previous one, or next one I guess, the Dragon Quest III Remake. Now the goal here with the Cave of Confusion is to reach the bottom of it, yes. It's like a 26 or 27 floor dungeon, something like that. But the catch is you cannot just leave whenever you want like all of the other dungeons. In fact, you have to reach a certain floor before you can find a teleport out, which is how you're going to leave the place. This means you need to go into this high-level dungeon prepared, and that's probably why you want to go to the Cloud's Gate Citadel and grind up some levels first, and also save before you go in here, of course. Now, the other sort of catch to this is that the floors in the Cave of Confusion don't work like they do elsewhere, as you would probably expect. You see, you're going to enter a dungeon floor you've been on before that will have a bunch of different exits. The catch is, most of those exits are going to put you right back at the start of the floor, and in order to get through it, you have to find the correct exit, which means you're going to be running back and forth a whole lot. This is where spells like Holy Protection, which can protect you from the constant random encounters, come in clutch, especially once you are at a point where the experience from these fights isn't super important to you. But doing all that, fighting all those battles, getting stronger, Of course, chasing down the story objectives, that's basically what this game is in terms of gameplay and its world, though because of the legend of the heroes that have come before you, which if you've played the previous games you'll have known personally, and seeing how they flesh out the world around that was a lot of fun for me personally. And it was nice seeing that evolve over the course of an entire trilogy. And yet, we are not done because next we need to talk about combat, which we're going to again have to separate between the first and second games. So, again, just as a little reminder, combat is pretty unbalanced across both games. You can solve that problem by grinding if you want. If you're having a ton of trouble, you can also turn on the game's invincibility mode. But first, of course, let's start with the first game. As I mentioned, you are a solo hero in this one. That's going to be a little tricky then because you have to fight all these monsters on your own. At the beginning half of the game, that's pretty fine. It's usually only 1 or 2 monsters, and they are easy enough to kill. But as the game starts to trudge on, you start facing boss monsters. That gets a little more complicated. You need to start finding ways to get ahead of the action economy because you are a single person, and against 4 or 5 foes potentially, you're going to get stun locked into the ground pretty easily. Your job then becomes dealing as much damage as possible to the entire group of enemies, and that's where your learned abilities as you level up come in, culminating in things like Giga Slash, which is going to hit every enemy on the playing field for potentially like 400-ish damage, which will typically kill most things in one shot in the first game. Combine that with the ability Wild Side to let you have 2 attacks in a row, and you should pretty much be golden. The catch then, of course, becomes dealing with the actual bosses, which have more health than you can just immediately brute force, and it's where you have to figure out the tactics and the sort of back and forth on it. Oftentimes there's something like a damage type or a status effect that they'll be dealing that you can find a way to prevent or circumvent that will make those fights a lot easier. But I'd be lying if I said I found it to be a super enjoyable experience or anything. It was mostly just, is what it is type of thing given the game's age. The second game, however, has a bit more going on, as you would imagine. Here you're going to have eventually a full 4-member party, and things like tactics and controlling individual characters becomes more of a thing. In particular, you can set the tactics for each character. I would caution you about this. Honestly, most of the AI for these tactic settings is not the brightest, though they do have one thing going for them in that they can actually react to things ahead of time, or as they happen, I should say, if they have the relevant tactics set up. And the reason that's important is because if you are controlling all the characters and giving them orders, you tell all of them what to do right at the start of the turn, basically, and then they do that based on their agility in relation to what the enemy is doing. The one bonus to actually using these tactics settings is that the tactics AI will react to things if they have the ability to do so as they happen. And what I mean by that is that if I'm controlling them manually, I don't necessarily know for sure if an enemy's going to die ahead of time, which means I have to make a best guess or approximation about what the best spell to use in that situation would be. The tactics AI, however, doesn't have that restriction. If, for instance, I have them just to attack all out and there's a metal slime on the field, they will go out of their way to attack those metal slimes in order to kill them and get the best experience possible, as you would expect. However, if that metal slime either flees or dies, as they tend to do, before that character gets their turn that turn, they will then actually adjust that spell and either, use an ability, spell, or attack that is not something that is going to be limited to that one slime. So while the AI itself is not terribly bright for these tactic settings, they do have the ability to react to things that you do not because of the way the sort of base combat system works. And I wanted to make sure that was clear here. But the other part of it is really buffs and debuffs. That's a big part of this. And also getting your stats up here. So in the second game, because you're facing a lot more enemies a lot more of the time, it's very easy to get just destroyed in the action economy. And so, finding ways around that is obviously going to be important. Yet again, finding ways to circumvent status effects or just being destroyed before you ever get to take a move, that kind of thing, is very helpful for certain pain points. For instance, bosses that happen to hit like a truck. Now, the other part of this is like your defense stat and your resilience stat, which are kind of tied together. Basically, as you level up, that will go up, and grinding just on its own, of course, increasing your stats will overcome some of these challenges just through sheer force. In particular, I noticed that like 5 to 10 levels above roughly where you're supposed to be in a given area would typically put your defense higher than the enemy you're dealing with was really prepared to deal with, and so you'd take a lot less damage. So sometimes, for particularly difficult encounters, if you don't want to throw on invincible mode, that was worth exploring, but otherwise it's like, make sure you're buffing your characters, using them effectively, like for instance, applying oomph to your big physical attackers, using Wild Side to double up, and then hitting with the powered up double attacks back to back, which is really, really strong. Finding ways to mitigate damage, like throwing up Magic Barrier to reduce incoming group spells from the enemy, stuff like that. So 2, while not honestly the most terribly complicated JRPG system in the world, does have enough going on to, I think, keep you pretty involved in the combat, but it's also, not exactly overwhelming in terms of mechanics either. But the sort of key factor for both games really is just taking advantage of the action economy, but for different reasons in each. In 1, you're a single character, and, basically any number of enemies will outdo you if you don't find a way to just destroy them very quickly. Which is why spells like Giga Slash, that will one-shot most of the basic enemies in that game once you get it, is so helpful. Whereas in 2, you need to dominate the action economy in a different way, but for much the same reason, to avoid getting stun-locked by superior numbers that will almost certainly be taking 2 turns apiece once you get to the endgame. And you've got to find ways to, of course, simply overwhelm them. All in all, though, pretty standard JRPG stuff. I don't think there's anything like wildly new or crazy in here. I will say I do think they mostly learned their lesson from 3. 3 had a problem with a lot of the in-game fights spamming like one-hit KO type stuff, or things that would just completely lock your party down. And while there is some of that here, it is not nearly as bad as it was in 3. So I'm assuming they adjusted that on the fly, because I know after launch, 3 got a sort of balance adjustment where they reined some of that in after the fact. But either way, from there, let's talk about the Steam Deck. So this game is, officially speaking, only playable on the Steam Deck, which actually surprised me a bit, because it is a game that plays very well on that platform. But if you look at the official reasoning, this is supposedly because the game has small text, but I personally didn't have any problem reading it, and in fact, the third game, which uses basically the exact same setup, is verified, so I feel like maybe they just got like a different verification checker that day or something, but I would say this game is more than playable there. Obviously, it's not like a super hardware-intensive game, and, a lot of these games just play well in a handheld form factor anyway, so you should be totally good to go there, which then brings us to our positives and negatives. So on the positive side of things, for me at least, this may seem a little amorphous, but honestly, just the enjoyment of playing through this entire trilogy and seeing what is the beginnings of like this really iconic series that Dragon Quest has become was a novel experience, and I think having that in a convenient way that you don't have to jump through any hoops to get access to on PC, as an example, is pretty great. They did expand 2 a little bit, so there's even some extra content there. And that full circle moment at the end of 2, where I was kind of like, done with this particular trilogy at the end of it, was a great experience. I had a lot of fun with that. I also think they did a great job with exploration in 2 in particular. That game feels like it just has tons and tons of secrets for you to find, with like the expanded map, the underwater exploration, all of these post-game dungeons. There's just so much stuff to find and do in that game that like 70% of my total time with this package was set in the second title. I think running around that one is really fun. I also think it has better characters. I think the Princess of Moonbrook is really well done in particular. And as I state in pretty much all of these games, I am a bit of a sucker for the HD-2D graphics in particular. I think that is just a gorgeous art style that really captures the feeling of old JRPGs in a fun way. And that, combined with just making these games more accessible overall, so people like myself who had never played them previously can experience them in all their glory, is a pretty great time. But nonetheless, there were a couple of negatives. The just really weird balance of these games strikes me as odd. Like, you're doing these full remakes, and then you just like let some of this stuff be really janky and weird in terms of its progression. Like, you're remaking these games from the ground up. Why not address some of that stuff? It's a strange thing to just leave in there. What's more, this is kind of a strange negative, but Dragon Quest 1 compared to Dragon Quest 2 here feels so incredibly basic. Like, if I were just reviewing this as Dragon Quest 1 for a remake, I honestly probably wouldn't have enjoyed it very much. Dragon Quest 1 was fine, but it's the more underwhelming game of these two. Both because of how short it is, how simple it is, how unbalanced the combat is, and then you get to 2, and the combat's still a bit unbalanced, sure, but there's just so much more there. And while I can appreciate that the original Dragon Quest I was a very bare-bones basic game because it was like, one of the very first JRPGs that set the stage for the genre itself, in today's day and age, I didn't walk away from one in particular like feeling great about it. It was just kind of like, okay, well, that's done, I guess. And then I went on to 2, and while I appreciate the background of having played 1 going into 2 I think is just straight up the better experience, even if it still has some of those same problems, which then brings me to my conclusion. So, the Dragon Quest 1 and 2 HD-2D remake is in fact $60 US over on Steam. And to be honest, I don't love that price for these really, really old games, especially when one of them is very basic. I do, however, think 2 was a lot of fun and worth experiencing. I think both of these games clearly learned at least some lessons from the remake of 3, as 3, at least on the launch at least, had a lot more pain points than these 2 do, even if the combat is still, very awkward at times. And so, I'll put it this way. I think these 2 remakes are worth playing just so you can experience 2. Which of the original trilogy is definitely my favorite one now. And so while I think 2 in particular is really worth experiencing, I also think both of these remakes, 1 and 2 plus 3 as well, would have all been better at like a $40 price point because of how old these games are to begin with, how simplistic stuff like, for instance, the entirety of Dragon Quest 1 is. And so for those reasons, while I did have a lot of fun with it, I also don't think I had $60 worth of fun either. And so for the vast majority of people, I would say these are probably worth picking up on sale. Given that the originals are almost 40 years old, I think you can wait a little longer for these 2 titles to be a little bit cheaper, and I feel like you'd get more bang for your buck that way. But either way, I had a really enjoyable experience with these games. I'm glad I played through them. Always fun to see a bit of, proper video game history in this way. And I will, at some point, definitely play more games in the Dragon Quest series. My understanding is I'm pretty sure they have more remakes on the way even. So we shall certainly see what happens. But for the sake of this review, I think that's pretty much going to do it. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.